The Black History of Shreveport, from Reconstruction to right now. Shreveport, Louisiana. If you only look at headlines, you will miss the truth. If you only look at crime statistics, you will miss the architecture. If you only look at politics today, you will miss the blueprint that was drafted more than 150 years ago. Because Black history in Shreveport did not begin with protests. It began with power. It began with ownership. It began with a man named Cedric Antoine. C.C. Antoine, the first architect. Before there were modern council meetings, before there were mayoral elections debated on Facebook, before there were first Black headlines in the 2000s, there was Antoine, a Union Army captain, a businessman, a landowner in Shreveport, a Louisiana state senator from Caddo Parish, and eventually in 1873, the 13th lieutenant governor of Louisiana. Let that sit for a second. 1873. Less than 10 years after slavery officially ended, and a Black man with ties to Shreveport was sitting in statewide executive office. That is not accidental history. That is strategic history. Reconstruction was a moment where formerly enslaved men didn't just ask for inclusion, they stepped into governance. Antoine represents something most people never talk about. Black political competence was proven early, but Reconstruction did not last. White supremacist backlash swept across Louisiana. Federal protections weakened. Violence and intimidation rose, and the progress that had begun was methodically rolled back. But here's the part they cannot erase. The idea had already been planted. Black Shreveport had tasted governance. And once you taste power, you never forget how it works. The long shadow of Jim Crow. After Reconstruction collapsed, Black Shreveport entered survival mode. This is the period most documentaries rush through. But we won't. Because this era tells you how a community survives when political doors are slammed shut, segregation hardened, voting restrictions tightened, economic access narrowed. So what did Black Shreveport do? It built parallel systems. Churches became strategy rooms. Fraternal organizations became financial institutions. Black-owned businesses became economic shields. The Calanthian legacy. The United Order of Calanthi was more than a social club. It was a lifeline. In an era when mainstream insurance companies refused coverage, when banks denied loans, when white-owned institutions blocked access, Black fraternal orders created burial insurance, financial assistance, and community protection systems. This is important because when people say Black wealth never accumulated, they forget something. It did accumulate, but it accumulated inside protected community ecosystems. Often outside mainstream record books. Mutual aid wasn't charity. It was strategy. It was economic sovereignty under restriction. And Shreveport had it. Civil rights. Shreveport, strategy under pressure. When the 1950s arrived, a new phase of the struggle began. This wasn't about parallel systems anymore. It was about integration. It was about dismantling barriers. And that required courage. Dr. C.O. Simpkins, strategist, not symbol. Dr. C.O. Simpkins was a dentist. But in Shreveport, that profession meant something different. It meant you had an office, and an office meant you had a meeting space, and a meeting space meant you could organize. He was part of the machinery of civil rights in Northwest Louisiana. He worked alongside national movement leaders. He endured violent backlash and intimidation because civil rights in Shreveport was not gentle, it was resisted. The myth that the South quietly accepted desegregation is exactly that, a myth. Shreveport's progress came with pressure, and Simpkins understood something powerful. Change requires structure. He didn't just protest, he coordinated. Rev. Dr. Harry Blake, the pulpit as power. Mount Canaan Baptist Church. If those walls could speak, they would tell stories of whispered strategy sessions, late-night planning, and sermons that were coded calls to action. Churches in Shreveport were not passive worship spaces. They were political engines. The pulpit became a platform for dignity, discipline, and defiance. Black leadership in Shreveport has always carried a spiritual backbone. Faith wasn't just religion, it was resistance. Ann Brewster, history's unsettled questions. Ann Brewster's name carries weight. Her 1964 death has remained part of community memory for decades. Official conclusions exist, but memory also exists. And sometimes history isn't just about what's written in reports. It's about what lingers in a community's spirit. Her story reminds us of something uncomfortable. The civil rights movement in Shreveport carried real risk. Organizers were not protected. Pressure was not abstract. Fear was not theoretical. Progress required bravery. Culture as power, the Municipal Auditorium era. In the 1960s and 70s, Shreveport became part of a Southern performance corridor. The Municipal Auditorium hosted artists traveling through Louisiana. Black audiences filled seats. Touring circuits brought revenue. Performance created economic circulation. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was economic stimulus. It was identity reinforcement. It was proof that Black excellence could not be confined to segregated backrooms. Culture is often underestimated in political history, but culture moves consciousness. And consciousness moves policy. We're only at the midpoint of this story because what we've covered so far: Reconstruction, Jim Crow survival, civil rights strategy, cultural expansion was foundation. The modern political transformation is next, and that's where this story becomes contemporary. Part 2, Modern Power, Builders, and the Living Era. The executive shift. History does not move in straight lines. It expands. It contracts. It reorganizes. And after civil rights legislation reshaped the legal landscape of America, Shreveport entered a new era, the era of institutional access. But access is not the same as control. And representation is not the same as transformation. That distinction matters. Cedric Glover, breaking the mayoral ceiling. In 2006, Shreveport elected its first Black mayor. That headline matters historically, but psychologically it matters even more. For generations, executive power in southern cities symbolized exclusion. So when Cedric Glover took office, the symbolism was obvious. But symbolism is easy. Administration is not. Executive leadership means budget control, department oversight, public safety direction, economic development negotiation. It means responsibility. And when a community elects its first Black mayor, expectations multiply. Glover's era signaled something deeper. Black leadership in Shreveport was no longer peripheral. It was central. Ollie Tyler, gender and power expansion. When Ollie Tyler became mayor, another boundary shifted. The first Black woman mayor in Shreveport. This wasn't just racial progress, it was gender progression inside Black political leadership. Now psychologically, here's what's important. When representation expands, scrutiny expands with it. The standard becomes heavier, and that's part of the evolution of power. Public safety and control of force. For much of Southern history, policing structures were enforcement arms of segregation. So when we analyze modern leadership in that arena, we have to understand the weight of that institution. Sheriff Henry Whitehorn, first Black sheriff of Caddo Parish, former Louisiana State Police Superintendent, former Shreveport Police Chief. That resume matters because public safety leadership requires institutional knowledge, political balance, command presence, trust management. Representation in law enforcement leadership in the South carries psychological symbolism, but it also carries measurable impact. The real question history will ask is not, was he first? It will ask, what changed? Clarence Reese Jr., Fire Chief, Executive Level Emergency Services Leadership. When Black leadership occupies command roles in emergency response institutions, it signals normalization of authority, not tokenization. Normalization. That distinction matters. Economic architects. Politics without economics is theater. Economic control is the deeper layer of power. Dr. Lamar Holden, infrastructure builder. Construction is not glamorous, but it is foundational. Dr. Holden's impact in Shreveport-Bossier construction represents something strategic: ownership of physical space. Workforce development, providing opportunity to individuals often excluded from traditional employment pipelines. Psychologically, infrastructure building is one of the strongest forms of long-term influence because concrete outlasts speeches. Legal and policy shapers. The law is not emotional. It is procedural. Attorneys shape outcomes in ways that the public often never sees. Joshua K. Williams represents a generation of legal professionals who operate inside institutional frameworks while remaining visible in community circles. Legal literacy inside a community increases its defensive strength. That's strategic history in motion. Council and governance influence. Dr. Allen Jackson Jr., education and financial aid administration background. Understanding access to higher education changes mobility trajectories. Policy influence around education determines who ascends, who stagnates, who leaves, who returns. That's long-term structural influence. Ursula Stevenson Bowman. Council leadership roles signal institutional integration. City council shapes, zoning, development approval, budget allocations, municipal priorities. It's quiet power, but it's real. Tabitha Taylor. Council leadership also includes advocacy around unresolved historical tensions. Modern governance sometimes intersects with historical re-examination. That shows maturity in civic systems. Victor L. Thomas. Parish government often flies under the radar, but infrastructure, parish resources, and budgetary flows determine neighborhood realities. Understanding parish influence is essential to understanding Shreveport's operational mechanics, activism, mobilization, and digital era power. History evolves. Influence shifts platforms. Marcus M.J. Johnson. Digital mobilization is modern organizing. Social media influence can shape turnout, frame narratives, pressure institutions. This is the 21st century version of pulpit influence. Craig Lee. Community pressure politics. Organizers often operate outside official office, but influence what officials can ignore. That tension is part of democratic function. Lynn Braggs. Community engagement leadership matters because it fills communication gaps between citizens and systems. Influence is not always tied to title. Sometimes it's tied to reach. Ryan Williams. Behavioral intervention systems represent preventative infrastructure. Violence reduction strategies are not only policing strategies, they are psychological intervention strategies. Carla Collins. Community-based violence prevention advocacy continues the civil rights tradition, but in a modern context. The battlefield shifts, the principle remains. Theron Jackson. Faith leadership still anchors community response during crisis. Church influence has never disappeared in Shreveport. It evolved. Quentin Aud. Emerging leadership pipelines represent generational transition. Every city's future is determined by who steps forward before they are fully established. Alvin R. Oliver. Entrepreneurial presence and economic participation remain pillars of community stability. Kenneth Howard. Community influence sometimes exists outside formal documentation, but still affects cultural climate. Robert Bruchan. Grassroots violence intervention. Nonprofit structure. Community engagement. When individuals operate outside government but influence outcomes inside neighborhoods, that becomes part of the historical continuum. The psychological thread. Now here's the part most documentaries don't say. Black history in Shreveport is not a straight climb. It is adaptive. It is cyclical. It is strategic. It moves from military service to political office, segregation to parallel systems, civil rights protests to institutional access, cultural power to economic networks, representation to structural negotiation. The question is never just who holds office. The real question is who controls structure? Part 3, the sheriff race that exposed the system. The setup. Let me tell you why the 2023-2024 Caddo Parish Sheriff race belongs in Black history. Not because it was close, not because it was dramatic, but because it exposed, in real time, the psychological core of Southern politics. Who gets to hold authority, and what happens when the outcome isn't convenient? This wasn't just an election. This was a stress test of the system. And like all stress tests, it showed the cracks. First, understand the context. Caddo Parish hadn't had routine transition at the top of that office in decades. Sheriff Steve Praetor's retirement created an open seat, a rare moment when the machine has to choose a new driver. That matters because when a seat is held that long, the position becomes more than a job. It becomes a culture. So the question was never only, who's the better candidate? The question was, who is the rightful successor to the culture of the office, and who represents a break? The first round, October 14th, 2023. The sheriff race starts in the Louisiana jungle primary system. Everybody runs. Top 2 advance. On October 14th, 2023, the top 2 were John Nicholson, Republican. Henry Whitehorn, Democrat. Nicholson led the first round but didn't clear 50%, so it went to runoff. Now right there is the first lesson in modern Shreveport politics. The city isn't one unified voting bloc. It's a coalition fight. Neighborhood by neighborhood, church by church, family by family, network by network. The runoff, November 18, 2023, 1 vote. Then comes the runoff on November 18, 2023. After more than 43,000 ballots, Whitehorn leads by 1 vote, 1. 1 vote is the kind of result that does something to people psychologically, because it forces everybody to confront something they don't want to admit. Sometimes history changes because a single person decided to show up and somebody else stayed home. A recount follows. Reporting indicates it kept the margin essentially intact. So now the story should be over, right? No, because in the American South, especially in offices tied to force, incarceration, and control, The story being over depends on whether the winners are tolerated. The lawsuit. When elections move from people to paper, Nicholson challenges the election in court. This is where it stops being campaign season and becomes a courtroom battle over legitimacy. The legal fight centered on claims of illegal voting. Now, I want you to think about what that does to a community, because the average voter hears illegal ballots and doesn't picture procedure. They picture corruption. They picture theft. And that's why these challenges carry power, even before a judge rules. December 5th, 2023, the result is voided. On December 5th, 2023, a judge rules the November runoff results are void, ordering a new election, citing that it was proven there were at least 11 illegal votes and that it's legally impossible to know the true winner given the one-vote margin. Let me translate what this means in plain language. When the margin is one vote, the legal system basically says, if there are more questionable votes than the margin, the legitimacy collapses. And whether you agree or disagree, that is the pivot point. Because now history is no longer being decided at the polls. It's being decided through courts, appeals, rulings, and deadlines. The Second Circuit Court of Appeal upholds the new election order in a split decision. The Louisiana Supreme Court declines to take the case, and the new election date gets locked. Now ask yourself, when the public watches a split court decision, and then a higher court refuses to intervene, what does that do? It doesn't just decide an election. It decides whether people trust the game, and Black history has always included this tension. We are told to participate, told to vote, told to trust institutions, while watching institutions reshape outcomes through process. The rematch, March 23rd, 2024. The rerun election is set for March 23rd, 2024, timed with presidential primaries and turnout jumps. This time, Whitehorn wins decisively, about 53%, and Nicholson concedes that night. And the Associated Press reports turnout rose to 65,239 voters in the rerun versus 43,247 in November. That number matters, because it tells you exactly what happened. When people felt the result could be taken away, more people showed up. That is not just politics, that's psychology. It's collective memory kicking in. It's the community saying, hold on, y'all not about to rewrite this quietly. And that's why this election is historic, not just because Whitehorn became the first Black sheriff of Caddo Parish, but because the road there became a public confrontation with legitimacy itself. July 1st, 2024, swearing in, power becomes real. Whitehorn is sworn in on July 1st, 2024 at the Shreveport Convention Center. At that moment, the symbolism ends and the responsibility begins. Because once you hold that office, the questions become concrete. Will policing culture shift? Will jail policy shift? Will community trust increase or collapse? Will violence go down? Will reform happen without chaos? History isn't kind about firsts. History asks, what did you do with it? Final thesis. Here's the uncomfortable truth. A lot of people love Black history as a museum. They love it when it's safe, when it's past tense, when the villains are obvious and the heroes are dead. But when Black history is alive, when it's a Black man becoming sheriff, a Black woman chairing council, a Black organizer forcing meetings, a Black attorney shaping outcomes, suddenly the conversation changes. Because real Black history does one thing. It forces the system to reveal itself. And this sheriff race revealed something clear. When the margin is tight, the fight isn't about who won. It becomes about who is allowed to win. So if you're watching this and you're from Shreveport, I'm going to say it directly. If you only show up when it's trending, you're not serious. If you only care when it affects you personally, you're not serious. If you treat power like entertainment, you're not serious. Because power doesn't care how you feel. Power responds to organization, turnout, and pressure. And that's the through line from C.C. Antoine to right now. Black progress in Shreveport has never been accidental. It has always been strategic, contested, and paid for. So the question at the end of this documentary is not, do we have Black history? The question is, do we have the discipline to protect it and the courage to expand it? Because history is not impressed by first. History only respects results.